is Debra Milke. She was sentenced to death and spent 22 years on death row for a crime she did not commit.
My innocence did not matter in their pursuit of a conviction. I had absolutely nothing to do with the brutal murder of my son, Christopher. And I did not give a confession to Mr. Saldate. Losing a child to murder is a devastating tragedy. Being falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit is also a devastating tragedy. Try to imagine that. What happened to me could happen to any one of you.
On a cold December morning in 1989, in the sprawling desert outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, the sun rose over a scene that would fracture a family, ignite a city's fury, and nearly claim the life of an innocent woman through the calculated machinery of the state. It happened in the early hours, the kind of dawn when the air is sharp, the sky bruised with purple, and the desert holds its breath before the heat returns. In a desolate drainage ditch, miles from civilization, a small body lay motionless against the cracked earth. His name was Christopher Milke. He was 4 years old. He had soft brown hair, curious eyes, and a future that should have stretched decades into an unknowable tomorrow. Instead, he had been shot 3 times in the head, execution style, and left in the dirt like discarded refuse. There were no witnesses, no weapon at the scene, no footprints leading away. Just a child murdered in silence. Within hours, detectives would make an arrest. But they wouldn't arrest a stranger. They wouldn't arrest a predator lurking in shadows. They would arrest the one person who should have been protected, supported, and believed. They arrested his mother. This is the story of Debra Milke, a 25-year-old woman who spent 22 years on death row for a crime she didn't commit, convicted on the word of a single detective with a history of lying, coercion, and abuse. A woman who came within weeks of a lethal injection based entirely on a confession that never happened. A story of grief weaponized, truth buried, and a justice system that chose convenience over conscience. This is the story of how close America came to executing an innocent mother, and how she survived to expose the lie that nearly killed her. December 2, 1989, began like any ordinary Saturday for Debra Milke. She woke in her small apartment in Phoenix, made breakfast, and prepared for what she thought would be a simple day. Christopher, her only child, was excited. James Stiers, a friend of Debra's roommate, had offered to take the boy to see Santa Claus at the mall, a holiday tradition Christopher had been looking forward to all week. Debra trusted Stiers. He had been around the house frequently, seemed kind to Christopher, and had never given her reason to worry. She kissed her son goodbye, watched him leave with Stiers and another man named Roger Scott, and went about her day believing her child was safe. But Christopher never made it to the mall. Instead, Stiers and Scott drove the boy nearly 40 miles into the desert, to a remote area known as the Papago Buttes. They lured him out of the car under some unknown pretense. And then, in cold blood, they shot him 3 times in the back of the head. Christopher died instantly. His small body was left in a wash, exposed to the elements, alone. By the time hikers discovered his body the next morning, Debra's world had already begun to collapse. Police arrived at Debra's apartment that evening. They told her Christopher was dead. She screamed. She collapsed. Neighbors would later recall the sound of her grief, raw, guttural, the kind of anguish that cannot be faked. But grief, in the eyes of law enforcement, can look like guilt. Detectives brought her to the police station for questioning. She went willingly, desperate to help, desperate to understand what had happened to her son. She expected to be asked what she knew about Stiers and Scott. She expected to be treated as a grieving mother. Instead, she was led into a small, windowless interrogation room and left alone with Detective Armando Saldate Jr. What happened in that room would determine the next 22 years of her life. According to Saldate, Debra Milke confessed. He claimed she admitted to conspiring with Stiers and Scott to have Christopher killed because she was tired of being a mother, because she wanted her freedom, because the boy was a burden she no longer wanted to carry. He claimed she spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, without remorse. There was just one problem. None of it was true. Debra has always maintained, consistently, unwaveringly, for over 3 decades, that she never confessed to anything. She says she asked for a lawyer. She says she cried and begged to see her father. She says Saldate refused both requests, interrogated her for hours without recording, and eventually left the room to write a statement claiming she had confessed. No audio recording. No video. No witnesses. No signed statement from Debra herself. Just Saldate's handwritten notes. Notes only he ever saw, words only he ever heard. And on the basis of those notes alone, Debra Milke was charged with capital murder. To understand the magnitude of what happened in that interrogation room, you must understand who Detective Armando Saldate was. By 1989, Saldate had already compiled a stunning record of misconduct. Internal Affairs had sustained complaints against him for lying under oath, coercing confessions, and violating suspects' constitutional rights. He had been accused of sexual misconduct during traffic stops. He had been disciplined for extracting false confessions from vulnerable witnesses, particularly women. Multiple judges had noted concerns about his credibility in prior cases. In short, Saldate was a detective whose word should never have been trusted without corroboration. But prosecutors didn't just trust him, they built their entire case around him. And when Debra's defense attorneys requested access to Saldate's disciplinary records, the state refused. They claimed the records were irrelevant. They buried them. They hid them from the jury. This suppression of evidence, known as a Brady violation, would later become the cornerstone of Debra's exoneration. But at trial the jury knew nothing about it. They heard Saldate testify under oath that Debra had confessed. They had no reason to doubt him. And so they convicted her. The prosecution's case against Debra Milke was shockingly thin. There was no physical evidence linking her to the crime. No DNA. No fingerprints. No murder weapon. No communications between her and the actual killers. No financial motive. No life insurance policy. No eyewitnesses. Stiers and Scott, the men who actually murdered Christopher, never implicated her. They never claimed she asked them to kill her son. They never testified that she knew anything about the plan. In fact, Stiers initially told police that Debra had no involvement whatsoever. But prosecutors didn't need evidence. They had something more powerful, a narrative. A mother who kills her own child. It was sensational. It was horrifying. It was enough. They painted Debra as cold and calculating, a woman desperate to escape the responsibilities of motherhood. They pointed to the fact that she had once considered giving Christopher up for adoption, something she had explored years earlier during a difficult period in her life, but ultimately decided against. They twisted her financial struggles into a motive for murder. And they put Detective Saldate on the stand to repeat his claim. She confessed. Debra's defense was hamstrung. Without access to Saldate's personnel file, they couldn't expose his history of lies. Without a recording of the interrogation, they couldn't prove the confession was fabricated. They had only Debra's word against a decorated detective's. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found her guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced her to death. Debra Milke was 25 years old. Arizona's death row for women is not simply a prison. It is a tomb. Debra was sent to the Lumley unit in Goodyear, Arizona, where she was placed in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, alone in a cell roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. No human contact. No sunlight. No fresh air. Just 4 walls, a narrow cot, and the suffocating weight of knowing the state planned to kill her for something she didn't do. Days bled into weeks. Weeks into years. Appeal after appeal was denied. The Arizona courts upheld her conviction. The state refused to release Saldate's disciplinary file. Prosecutors argued that his history was irrelevant because the jury had already convicted her. But Debra refused to give up. Her father, Mark Sadiq, visited her as often as the prison allowed. He wrote letters to lawyers, journalists, advocacy groups, anyone who might listen. He believed his daughter with an unshakable conviction, and he refused to let her die in silence. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the 2 men who actually killed Christopher remained in custody. Stiers was sentenced to death. Scott received life in prison. but neither of them ever said Debra was involved. And still she remained on death row. In the early 2000s, a new legal team took on Debra's case. They began digging deeper into Detective Saldate's background, scouring old court records, tracking down prior defendants he had interrogated, and piecing together a pattern of misconduct that was both extensive and chilling. What they found was damning. Saldate had a documented history of fabricating confessions, particularly from women. He had been repeatedly reprimanded for constitutional violations. In multiple cases, judges had questioned his truthfulness. In at least one case, a conviction had been overturned specifically because of Saldate's misconduct. Armed with this evidence, Debra's attorneys filed a federal habeas corpus petition, arguing that her conviction was obtained through prosecutorial misconduct and a fundamentally unfair trial. In March 2013, after years of litigation, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a stunning ruling. In a 77-page opinion, the court eviscerated the prosecution's case and Saldate's credibility. Judge Alex Kaczynski wrote that the state had committed egregious misconduct by suppressing evidence of Saldate's history. He noted that no reasonable jury, had they known the truth about the detective, would have convicted Debra based solely on his word. The court's language was scathing. No civilized system of justice should have to depend on such flimsy evidence, quite possibly tainted by dishonesty or overzealousness. Debra Milke's conviction was vacated. After 22 years, 7 months, and 21 days on death row, she walked out of prison a free woman. Freedom for Debra did not mean healing. She emerged from prison in her late 40s, her youth stolen, her son long buried, her life fractured beyond repair. She had missed decades of the world, technology, culture, relationships. She had lived in a cage the size of a bathroom while the state prepared to kill her for a crime she didn't commit. Prosecutors attempted to retry her, but without Saldate's fabricated confession, they had no case. In March 2015, all charges were dismissed. Debra Milke was officially exonerated. As for Detective Saldate, he faced no criminal charges. No prison. No punishment. He retired quietly, collecting his pension. The system that nearly killed an innocent woman protected the man who lied to convict her. Debra Milke's story is not an anomaly. It is a warning. It reveals how fragile justice truly is, how easily it can be corrupted by ambition, ego, and indifference. How a single lie told by someone in a position of authority can destroy a life. And it reminds us that the death penalty is irreversible. Had Debra been executed before her exoneration, the truth would have died with her. She survived. But the memory of those 22 years will never leave her. And neither should they leave us.